Hey, welcome back to Sapper Woodworking. I wanted to do a quick shout out to my friends Andy and Stephanie who gave me this pile of hardwood here, as well as some additional red oak wood that's already been processed and will be made into some cutting board soon. A couple of the pieces that the scraps that they gave me were these, which is IPE. It's spelled IPE. It's, I believe, the hardest commercially available hardwood. It's usually used for outdoor decks and projects where you really need good weather protection. I've never turned anything with it. I've made a couple smaller projects out of this particular wood. It's hard and dense, and it was very difficult on the tools. So I used mainly carbide tipped lathe tools to turn this. It was like I said, my first IPE project on the lathe. I don't know whether I would do another one. It took a tremendous amount of sanding to get this smooth. It's like cutting concrete. But it was a fun project. I like how it turned out. And this piece was accented with some yellow heartwood along with the IPE. So Andy and Stephanie, this will be yours soon. And stay tuned and we'll show you how this was made. Thanks.
I had wanted to go over a couple of things that made this project a little bit unique, and one is the weight that I mentioned earlier. This particular piece of material glued up at about 14.5 by 14.5 inches, which is about 370 by 370 millimeters, and the weight came in at about 12.6 pounds. And for reference, two of the more hard and dense U.S. domestic woods that you can get are white oak and hickory, and the relative weight of the same size piece of either white oak or hickory is about 9.2 pounds, making the IPE lumber quite a bit heavier than those two woods. The second thing I wanted to mention, that IPE is known to be a high oil content wood. It's from the tropics and it's very resistant to weather, so it does have a high oil content in it. So prior to actually gluing it up, I ended up rubbing the gluable surfaces rather heavily with denatured alcohol, which is a solvent that helps, in theory, dissolve some of the oil in the wood and remove that. So I'm gluing more of a solid wood surface, and the oil won't get in the way of the adhesion of the glue. So you've seen that I've mounted a faceplate on this blank, and now I've got it mounted on the lathe, and I'm just starting to do some rough turning. I don't intend to have any music playing during this video, because just the sound of the tool as it's kind of grinding away at that hard, dense IPE is kind of entertaining in its own light. And if you do actually compare it to some other videos, it does sound different. There's so much silica and rot resistance built into this wood that it just makes a different noise, and it just sounds a little bit harsher than when you're cutting what I would call normal domestic woods. The other thing to mention is that if you take a look at the slow motion video, there's a lot of dust that comes off this material when you're cutting it. So I would highly recommend you wear the best PPE that you have. In fact, when I was turning this dish, I ended up having a brand new N95 mask on, as well as a full face shield with its own separate ventilation system. This is not the kind of sawdust that you want to get in your lungs, so definitely invest in some good PPE. I progressed to the point where I'm removing most of the material, which will be the top inside of the dish. I've done that with the dish facing the headstock before. I've gone ahead and here moved on to the rough shaping of the outside of the platter. Yeah, at this point you can really hear in the sound of the audio of just that special grinding, that little high-pitched whine that you hear when you're cutting wood that's just incredibly hard. So I've progressed to the point where I'm going to consider flipping the dish around, and I'm just taking a pencil and kind of guiding it with the diameter of my 4-jaw chuck. And so I've left a pencil mark approximately the size of the cavity that I'm going to remove, and then later on I'll take the 4-jaw chuck, will expand and lock into that little cavity, and then I can flip the dish around and mount it back on the lathe and work to hollow out the final shape of the inside. But before I get to that process, you'll see me here hollowing out this little cavity, and then once that's done and the jaw has fit correctly, I will actually completely finish the bottom of the bowl through its final sanding and polishing before I actually mount the jaw and flip it around. All right, now that I know that the 4-jaw expandable chuck fits nice and tight in that little recess I've cut, I'll just go through the process of sanding this dish smooth. And like I said earlier, this took a long time. I could show you minutes and minutes of video, but eventually we got it smooth and to the point where I can apply some finish. Here I'm applying a lacquer sealer, which will be the process we'll use to get the wood sealed before we can move on to actually buffing it out with various wax compounds. In this case, I've chosen to use Mylan's, which is a really nice product. Now with the bottom of the platter finished, I'm going to remount the 4-jaw chuck, and as I'm cranking on this little chuck key, the jaws will expand and lock themselves into the cavity that I previously cut. Then I can flip the plate around and mount it on the lathe. And I had a sort of a major problem on my hands here. And even though I had used pilot holes when I mounted my faceplate, every single one of those screws snapped off inside of the platter itself. And I eventually figured out I could just use a plug cutter and drill out around each one of the screws, and then take a screwdriver and snap out the plug. It left a big, huge cavity there that you can see all those holes, and I ended up trashing a plug cutter, but it did save the project to that point. Now we're at the home stretch of the project, just fine-tuning the inside of the dish, removing the rest of that material that formerly supported the faceplate, and being very careful not to be too aggressive on the cutting, because even though the 4-jaw chuck will hold that bowl on really well, you just never know if you get a catch. The whole thing might come flying off the lathe, so we're just processing through it really slowly. And we'll just repeat the same process on the inside of the bowls that we used on the outside, which is a Mylan's sanding sealer, and then onto their wax buffing friction polish, which leaves a really nice finish. Well, so at this point, we're just about completed. I'll end up removing the platter from the 4-jaw chuck, and you can really see that shine that results from the buffing finish from the Mylan's product. And the final platter ended up weighing in at about 3.4 pounds. So a ton of material gets removed in the process of making something on the lathe. But this is certainly a fun and worthwhile project. It turned out really nice, and I certainly hope that Andy and Stephanie liked their gift. Thanks for watching. If you are interested in more of my videos, please consider clicking on the subscribe button, and you'll be notified when those videos get posted. Thanks.